Good evening. Welcome to this discussion panel of the 2021 Six Bridges Book Festival, a program of the Central Arkansas Library System. My name is Laura Barrio. I'm a professor of English at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And I will be in charge of moderating tonight's panel, which is being recorded a week in advance due to last-minute scheduling conflicts. Unfortunately, this means our audience members won't have a chance to ask any questions, but we hope you will nevertheless enjoy our conversation and presentation. So tonight we are honored to have Kaitlyn Greenidge and Michael Farris Smith with us, showcasing their most recent publications. Kaitlyn Greenidge's debut novel is We Love You, Charlie Freeman, and it was one of New York Times critics' top 10 books of 2016. Her writing has appeared in Vogue, Glamour, the Wall Street Journal, Elle, you name it, too many to name. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Whiting Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University, and the Guggenheim Foundation. She is currently features director at Harper's Bazaar, as well as a contributing writer for the New York Times. Her second novel, Libertie, right here, is out now and has been already named one of the most anticipated books of 2021 by none other than the Oprah magazine. You know that you've made it when O recommends you, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, and a whole host of other publications. Michael Farris Smith is an award-winning writer whose novels have appeared on the Best of the Year lists with Esquire, NPR, Southern Living, Book Riot, and numerous others, and have been named Indie Next List, Barnes & Noble, Discover, and Amazon Best of the Month selections. He has been the finalist for the Southern Book Prize, the Gold Dagger Award in the United Kingdom, and the Grand Prix de Lettres in France. His essays have appeared with the New York Times, Bitter Southerner, Garden and Gun, and many more. His previously published books are Blackwood, The Fighter, Desperation Road, Rivers, and The Hands of a Strangers. Nick, which we are featuring tonight, is his most recent publication and is a Garden and Gun top of 2021 reading list for Southerners, Entertainment Weekly top reads of to start 2021, and a whole host of other top 10, top to read publications. So I would like to start by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your book. Like, what can you share with the audience to encourage them to read the book without any spoilers, of course? Who would like to go first?
Kaitlyn, I'll let you go ahead.
Sure. So Libertie is about, it's based on the life of the first Black female doctor in New York State named Dr. Susan Smith McKee Stewart. And she grew up in a free Black community that was in what's now central Brooklyn called Weeksville. She had a really sort of unusual childhood in that she was born free at a time when most Black women were enslaved. And the story is based on a true story of her and her daughter, who ended up marrying the son of the Episcopal Archbishop of Haiti and moving to Haiti. But in the novel, in the fictionalized version that I've written, Libertie and her mother, Dr. Sampson, are both sort of contending with what it means to be free and how they're hoping to define freedom directly after the Civil War, so after the end of slavery, in the days of Reconstruction, as Black people in the US are sort of contending with how and where they want to determine their own lives.
Michael, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. First of all, that sounds fascinating, Kaitlyn, as it clearly is. I had a weird relationship reading The Great Gatsby, like a lot of people have. A lot of people have it forced upon them, like I did when I was much younger. I think my first year of college, and I kind of tossed it to the side and didn't really get it, and didn't really care about it whatsoever. And then I ended up living abroad for a few years, and I read it in my late 20s, and things in it kind of started to strike me a little differently. Plus, I was kind of on the verge of starting to want to write myself. And I was really being influenced by the Lost Generation writers um, during those years of mine. Um, and then you fast forward 15 more years again, when I was bored one day and I picked up Gatsby in my study and I just started reading it. And I had just an incredible reading experience with it. It struck me in ways could never have imagined. It was like not just the language and the lyricism of that, but I felt a great sense of loneliness and isolation, um, emotional desperation in it. A lot of things that I guess I've dealt with and kind of could relate to in my own life. And I remember sitting Gatsby down that day and thinking about Nick Carraway and what could possibly bring him to tell the story the way he told it. What could possibly bring a guy to forget it's his birthday, which he does in the novel, and go on to describe his 30s anticipating a decade of loneliness. Those things just really struck me, and I stared out the window for a little while, and I just kept thinking about Nick, and the thought crossed my mind, it'd be really interesting if someone were to write his story, because he doesn't tell you hardly anything about himself, because it's a first person narration. And almost by the time I could complete that thought, I just thought, well, why don't you do it? So that's what Nick is. I sat down and I wrote Nick Carraway's story that walks him up. It's the couple of years preceding the moment that he meets Gatsby in West Egg.
So let's actually talk about those two fantastic sources of inspiration that you both had for both of your novels. Um, in the case of Libertie, I was wondering, Kaitlyn, why why did you choose Libertie as your first person narrator? What drew you to her, and why not choosing her mother, for example, as the narrator of the story?
So part of where the inspiration for Libertie came from was I was working at a Black History Museum that was dedicated to the history of this Black community, Weeksville, that I mentioned earlier. And one of my tasks there was that I was working on the oral history project, and we were interviewing descendants of people who had lived there. So I actually interviewed one of Dr. Susan Smith McKinney's descendants, soap opera actress named Ellen Hawley, who's also written about her family history. So she has a book that sort of details the full history if anybody is interested in it. But when I spoke with her, she sort of, I assumed that I didn't know anything about the story. And I assumed when I first spoke with her that she was going to sort of talk about, very standard narratives of like Black excellence, Black exceptionalism, kind of the standard narratives that a lot of Black public history is built around. But it was really interesting to talk with her because she was very proud of her family's accomplishments, but she was also extremely candid about the dark side of all of that. And sort of, she spoke in terms of it of being growing up in an all-white neighborhood in her Black family, knowing that they integrated this neighborhood and how incredibly painful that was and how incredibly emotionally trying that was. And that it was both a source of pride, but also a source of a real emotional wounding. And so I'd already been sort of contending with this idea around how much of, if people in the US get any sort of Black history, it's about the exceptional figures, talking about ordinary sort of everyday working class Black people as historical figures, as people of note, as people who have a culture worth knowing, is extremely rare, or worth studying is extremely rare. And so I wanted to write a character who is in conversation with all those ideas around sort of Black excellence and but who doesn't want that path for themselves at all, and sort of comes up and contends against what that means and how you make a life that's outside of that narrative, that's outside of that understanding of meaning.
Yeah. And I love the result. That's all I'm going to add for that. I have more questions about your research process, but I want to ask Michael. I mean, you've already talked a little bit about how rereading The Great Gatsby led you to rethink some of its themes and consider Nick as, you know, a character that you could build a whole story around, specifically before what we see happening in The Great Gatsby. But one of the things that I found really fascinating about the narrative, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but so I'll just make very general comments. It was Nick's experience at war, like what it means for him to have experienced the World War. And then even I was really drawn by your exploration of, you know, the consequences of PTSD, you know, how it plays out in his life and in the life of other characters around him. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Why only go, you know, a couple of years prior to what we see in the Great Gatsby? You know, you could have started with Nick's childhood and just leave it there. And we do get glimpses of it, but it's those formative years that you know draw the narrative that I would like for you to tell us more about, I guess.
Right. Well, I talked about my the influence of the lost generation. You know, being a Mississippi writer, I get asked all the time about Southern writers and Mississippi writers and this and that and other. But truly, my very first influences were the lost generation writers, and not just it was what they were writing, but just also the time period too. They were coming off the World War I, and there's just kind of these feelings of disillusionment, and what they were doing artistically, and how invested they were in language and all those things. And because of that, the war seemed like a logical place for me to start with Nick. And two, I mentioned his extraordinary feelings of detachment that he expresses in the end of the novel. And I thought something has brought him to be this way. I mean, he's just not normal. Like and immediately I just thought of the war and the impact of the war. And we know a lot more about PTSD now, you know, than we did. And that just seemed to sit out at the forefront for me. And also when he meets Gatsby for the first time, the connection they make, the very first thing they make is they ask each other where they were in the war. So the war is front and center. And I thought a couple things. One, it would be a very intense landscape for me to dive into. I mean, writing the scenes in the trenches. I mean, like I've seen movies about World War I, and I've seen the way it's depicted or read about it in a book or something. When you really start diving into what World War I was like and what those people went through and the trauma they must have went through and how they even survived it, the trenches and the rats and the disease and the bayonets and the mustard gas and on and on and on and on. I thought, what a horrific experience. But for a writer, I thought, what an intense and extraordinary experience to try to capture. And I wanted that intensity. I think, why did I start there? It goes along with that too. I just like the intensity of storytelling, and I believe in starting a novel kind of in the middle, you know, so to speak. I think Kaitlyn will probably agree. You got to start with people who already have problems. And Nick in the war, he was already battling for his life and scared for his life on page one. And I mean, that's kind of desperation I think you want out of your characters. And that was some really interesting writing for me to try to create the war like the way the war was. And I really did not want to romanticize it. I was very not worried, but I was like, if I'm going to write World War I, then I'm going to write World War I, and you know, as realistically as I can, and hopefully it came off that way.
And I'm actually curious about your research process regarding, you know, how you captured that war experience. Because I have to admit that, you know, I've watched plenty of war movies, though, and documentaries about World War I. I've read many other novels that have war at the core of its story as one of its main conflicts. And I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that it did not feel like the type of narrative that I often see others resort to, where it's a very masculinized point of view that kind of excludes some of us, where we don't get to really connect very much with what's happening to these soldiers. How, I mean, other than your genius in capturing these emotions and this conflict, uh, did you do any research or interview any war vets to find out more about, you know, how to write about these?
The main stuff I looked at, I did watch a couple of documentaries on trench warfare, and I also found a documentary on the tunnels, which that blew my mind when I started reading about tunnel warfare in World War One. And I knew
I had
immediately
no
where
idea
I
about
was
tunnel
sending. Yeah,
warfare, by
I
the
didn't
way.
either. And when I started reading about it, my mind was blown, and I knew I was going to send Nick in there just because I wanted to write about the tunnels. Um, uh, I also PTS. I read some stuff about PTSD just to make sure that I was kind of feeling it the right way and I was creating the right kind of experience to enhance that as much as possible. You know, I will tell you that I don't like homework, and this is the first historical novel I've ever written, and very likely the last, just because I was overwhelmed by the amount of homework that you have to do and research you have to do. In my other 5 novels, if I don't know the answer, if I can't Google it, find the answer in about 5 seconds, I either just cut it out or make it up, you know, and you can't do that when you're writing a historical novel. I get the feeling Kaitlyn might actually like the research. I don't know. Some people do. It was very interesting to me, and I realized the extreme importance of it. But I do think, and this is probably where my laziness came in handy, is I do think you can over research to the point to where your imagination is robbed from what's going on in your head, your vision for it, which is eventually going to rob the readers of the imagination and the vision of it. So, you know, I did those couple things and I read up on things, but also as the novel got going, if I needed to look up something, I would, but otherwise I just kind of let it go and ran with the things I had learned already.
I mean, I have to admit that I thought I knew, I mean, not everything obviously about World War One, but you open up my eyes to things like the tunnel war and things that I had never heard of, that I found truly fascinating, and that I think that readers are also going to thoroughly enjoy. Kaitlyn, I want to ask you a similar question regarding your research. So you've told us a little bit about how you discovered the story about this woman doctor, but one of the things that I found, this is just personal bias, but I was really curious about how much research or how much prior knowledge you had about all the details that you provide about plant remedies and natural cures and herbal medicine. There are all these beautiful references and scientific references to what this woman was working with that just blew me away. So where do you find that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Michael was saying, you know, there's a danger of over research. So there's like a danger of just becoming swamped in the information. And then of course, you know, we are writing fiction. Our books are both fiction, and it has to come alive on the page at a certain point for a reader. It can't just be sort of listing all the really interesting or fun things that you find. So for me, I was, you know, thinking about the things that I knew about the historical figure doctor's life, that she was a homeopath, that she was trained in this school of medicine that in the, you know, mid 19th century would have been considered sort of like cutting edge medicine. You know, now homeopathy is considered a sort of like, you know, a more alternative medicine, counterculture type thing. But in the 1850s, 1860s, when, you know, it's just before sort of the explosion in medical knowledge that would have happened at the end of the 19th century, homeopathy was really seen as sort of a way forward and a way to sort of think about medicine that wasn't just about, you know, leeching people or sort of cutting with people, like a more holistic and more helpful way of dealing with people. And so that metaphor around what homeopathy is, which is, you know, like cures like, is the sort of core tenant ideal, sort of led me, I think, with the research and thinking about how to use that metaphor in terms of building her character and in terms of building that how that character thinks about the world and understands the world, and both how that opens the world for her in certain ways and the way that also limits some of the ways that she's able to understand what's happening to her in the book.
Absolutely. And then, you know, so that's certainly crucial to, you know, just making sure that the story feels as real as it was. But then I love how you take license in imagining what her daughter's relationship with this woman was, right? Like that's the essence of the book, and how her daughter sees her both as this gigantic figure that can do all kinds of amazing things and has all these powers that seem supernatural sometimes, but at the same time she sees all the flaws in her mother. Like she's not perfect, even though she's this larger than life figure as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to play with was, you know, this mythologization around Black mothers in particular, you know, Black mothers either as being sort of like selfless saints or, you know, really pathologically awful to their children and unfit to care for children. And those are sort of the two really polar opposite spaces that we exist in larger sort of American culture. And so I wanted to play with those extremes. You know, Libertie sees her mother as, you know, basically like a god, as someone who's able to resurrect the dead when she first meets her. And then she's sort of trying to figure out and reconcile that intense valorization that she has as of her mother with her mother as an actual human being, and a human being that is going to have different and conflicting you know, aims than Libertie does as she grows up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to give you all a break in terms of, you know, answering probably too professorial of a set of questions. And I would like to ask you, like, is there any story or passage in the book that you're particularly proud of? And would you mind reading an excerpt from your book so that the audience can get a taste of your work? And I'll let you pick who wants to go first.
If Kaitlyn,
sure,
Kaitlyn has, do you have a book? Yeah, let her go, because I don't even have a book with me.
If you want to grab your book, I have a book right here, and then you can grab, and then we'll.
Let me grab.
Okay, so I will read, I think, the first opening pages of Libertie. This is the first chapter. I think all you have to know about it is that it takes place in 1860. I saw my mother raise a man from the dead. It still didn't help him much, my love, she told me, but I saw her do it all the same. That's how I knew she was magic. The time I saw Mama raise a man from the dead, it was close to dusk. Mama and her nurse, Lenore, were in her office. Mama with her little greasy glasses on the tip of her nose, balancing the books, and Lenore banking the fire. That was the rule in Mama's office. The fire was kept burning from dawn till after dinner, and we never let it go out completely, even on the hottest days, when my linen collar stuck to the back of my neck and the belly of Lenore's apron was stained with sweat. A mess of logs and twigs was lit up down there, waiting. When the dead man came, it was spring. I was playing on the stoop. I'd broken a stick off the mulberry bush. So young, it had resisted the pull of my fist. I'd had to work for it. Once I'd wrenched it off, I stripped the bark and rubbed the wet wood underneath on the flagstone, pressing the green into rock. I heard a rumbling come close and looked up, and I could see down the road a mule plodding slow and steady with a covered wagon, a ribbon of dust trailing behind it. In those days, the road to our house was narrow and only just cut through the brush. Our house was set back. Grandfather, my mother's father, had made his money raising pigs and kept the house and pens away from everyone else to protect his neighbors and his reputation from the undermining smell of swine. No one respects a man, no matter how rich and distinguished looking, who stinks of pig scat. The house was set up on a rise so that we could always see who was coming, and usually it was Mama's patients walking or limping or running to her office, and wagons were rare. When it first turned onto our road, the cart was moving slowly, but once it passed the bowed over walnut tree, the woman at the seat snapped her whip and the mule began to move a little faster until it was upon us. "Where's your mother?" I opened my mouth, but before I could call for her, my mother rushed to the door, Lenore behind her. Quick was all Mama said, and the woman came down off the seat. A boy about 12 or 13 followed. They were both dressed in mourning clothes. The woman's skirt was full. Embroidered on the bodice of her dress were a dozen black lilies done in cord. The boy's morning suit was dusty but perfectly fit to his form. At his neck was a velvet bow tie, come undone on the journey. The woman carried an enormous beaded handbag. It too was dusty but looked rich. It was covered in 1,000 little eyes of jet that winked at me in the last bit of sun. "Go, Lenore," my mother said, and Lenore and the woman and the boy all went to the back of the wagon, the boy hopping up in the bed and pushing something that lay there, Lenore and the woman standing, arms ready to catch it. Finally, after much scraping, a coffin heaped out of the wagon bed. It was crudely made, a white, bright wood, heavy enough that Lenore and the woman stumbled as they carried it. When the coffin passed me, I could smell the sawdust still on it. My mother stepped down off the stoop then, and the four of them lifted it up and managed it into the office. As soon as they got it inside, they set it on the ground and pushed it home. I could hear the rough pine shuffling across the floor. "You're early," Mama struggled with the box. "Don't start with me, Kathy," the woman said, and Lenore looked up, and so did I. No one except grandfather before he died dared call Mama Kathy. To everyone else, except for me, she was always doctor. But Mama did not bristle and did not correct as she would have with anyone else. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, what comes next is fantastic, but no spoilers. Oh God. Michael, have you been able to locate something to read for us?
Yeah, since we were talking about the war, I'll just read a passage. It's one of my favorite passages, actually, that you kind of forget about, and then it comes back around. In the course of the war, Nick is thrown into a giant pit full of dead bodies. They're believing he's dead. He's been wounded. And he wakes in the middle of the night and finds himself there in that mass of bodies. And this is how it goes. Eventually, he slid open his eyes and saw the soldiers standing at the edge of the pit smoking cigarettes, and every few minutes, other men in uniform would appear at the edge of the pit with a big wheelbarrow stacked with the dead. The bodies wore different flags on their sleeves, but that mattered no more, as the pit was a place of equality. Nick watched as more bodies were dumped, and they slid down and tumbled awkwardly onto the others. He couldn't move or they would kill him, and he knew he was bleeding from more than one place, but his choice was to move and be shot or stay still and pray that he didn't bleed dry before he could try and climb out and into the cover of night. To where? He didn't know. He prayed. He promised God and Jesus and Mary and whoever else would listen that if someone would please save him, he would give it all back. And I will pray every morning and every night, and I will give everything I have away, and I will feed the poor and read to the sick, and please let me out of this hole, and please stop this bleeding. And if you help me climb out of this pit, please, dear God, let my legs work, and I promise I will give it all back. He prayed and promised and prayed and promised for 2 days, as there seemed to be no rush by the men surrounding the pit. He tried not to sleep, but he dozed in and out, and there was nothing in his dreams that didn't involve the wrath of man. And as soon as he woke, he began to pray and promise once again, as if it were synchronized with his cautious breathing. The Germans kept smoking and kept dumping bodies, and then finally, after 2 days and 2 nights of playing dead, after ignoring the vermin that crawled across his face, after promising God and the saints a lifetime of service and gratitude, he heard the German word for fire, and he had no choice. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, and the sky bled from pink in the west to lavender in the east, and he knew that once dark fell, he had to move. His lips were dry and cracked, and he ached for water and food, and he didn't know if his arms and legs would work. After dusk, he listened for the voices, but they had moved away from the pit. He watched and listened, and the stars appeared and flickered across an endless sky. And then he moved. He began by wiggling free from the dead that covered his legs and pressed against his head and chest, and as he twisted and turned, he had to bite the collar of his shirt to keep from screaming as a shout of pain raced down his spine. Rats and mice skittered across the dead litter as if aroused by his movement, and with a clenched jaw, he freed himself from the bodies. He was hurt and thankful for the dark, so that he couldn't see what he looked like, because he knew that would make it easier to give up. He crawled up, stiffened bodies and the smell of hell and eyes frozen open that envied him as he maneuvered his way to the edge of the pit. Again, he listened and he heard voices, but they were at a distance, so he lifted his head and looked out across the land. Maybe 100 yards away, men gathered around campfires and milled around tents. There were hundreds of tents and dots of firelight orange spread out across the treeless fields, but they were all away from the pit. And then he heard a weak voice. Help me. He turned and looked. An arm raised from the corpses, and the voice came again. Help me. A soldier yelled something at the edge of the campsite, and he could not wait. He wanted to say to the voice, I can't help you. I want to, but I can't, and I hope that you don't remember that I was here and that you asked me, but I can't, and I pray to God that you die before they bring the fire.
That is one of those moments in the novel that still haunts me. It's just, oh my God, it's heartbreaking and too real, unfortunately. It feels very real the way you describe it. Right before we started this session, we were talking a little bit about the wonderful book covers that you both have gotten. So I'm going to start with Kaitlyn and just say, like, how on earth did you get this beautiful cover for your book? Do you have any saying into it, or did you just get lucky that your editors picked this particular image?
Not much say. I mean, a little bit of say in that they told me they were the illustrator they're going to work with, and my one sort of request / demand was that if they were going to put a person on the cover, that a big part of the novel is the fact that Libertie is a dark-skinned Black woman moving through the world. And so whatever sort of representation they're going to put her on the cover, I asked that she be represented in that way. And then the illustrator, as he was working on it, we were sort of emailing back and forth, and he was talking about the direction it was going to go in. And I said, I did a lot of research on all these different plants because of the homeopathy part of it. And so I'd made myself like a plant Bible where I'd sort of collected all these different images of all these different plants in Haiti and in New York State. And I sent that to him. And so he's, a real genius. He incorporated all those plants onto the cover and really made it really beautiful and really of the places that the novel takes place in. So I was just really lucky with all of that.
It's beautiful. I mean, I have to admit, it's outstanding. And I have actually been to Haiti at a conference, nothing fancy. And I have specifically not only been into Port-au-Prince, but also Jacmel, where part of the story takes place. And I was actually wondering if you've ever been to Jacmel or done any research on it, because there were some scenes where you were describing the marketplace and so forth, that's still standing. Not being used currently, but Jacmel is still a thriving artistic community, beautiful, full of color, and that's kind of what the cover reminded me of the beautiful bright colors that I had seen in Haiti and in Jacmel and all the art that I had seen there.
Yeah, that's such a huge compliment. I only got to go to Haiti for about 5 days of research. So part of the time in Port-au-Prince and part of the time in Jacmel. And Jacmel came up because I was doing, research in Haiti and where I wanted to sort of set this story. And I was reading a lot, and Edwidge Danticat has a really beautiful nonfiction book called After the Dance that's about carnival in Haiti, and specifically about Jacmel, because Jacmel is famous for its carnival celebrations. And as you said, it's a city of artists. If you ever get a chance to visit, one of the really remarkable things about it is you can walk around to all of these small artist studios where people spend the whole year preparing for carnival. They're making these absolutely amazing masks out of just foraging all these different things. It's fantastic. And you're in a city that loves artists, loves writers, loves poetry, loves music, just is infused with all of that. And the other thing about Jacmel, I could go on and on, but the other thing that's very striking about it is, if you have ever been to New Orleans, it looks exactly like New Orleans. When you walk down their Market Street, it looks exactly like Bourbon Street. I mean, like a photo, one photo on top of the other. It is, it's not that remarkable when you think about the history, but if you're someone who's been to both places, it's actually really eerie to sort of walk down there and realize how connected that history is. And how connected those places are. When people joke that New Orleans is the farthest north Caribbean city, it's not a lie. It's very true. So,
I mean, the architecture there, it's like, yeah, when I was there, I was reminded of New Orleans. It's like you're traveling in time and space, you name it. So I am so glad to hear that you actually had a chance to be to Jacmel, because if anybody ever has an opportunity to do so, you should. It's just beautiful. Despite how much they've had to struggle as a result of all the earthquakes and so forth. But I want to give Michael also a chance to brag about the fact that thanks to copyright, kind of like dying away, he got a chance to get this fabulous cover for his novel. Tell us a little bit about the story behind it.
Yeah, it's different because I really had no idea which direction they might want to go. In previous novels, we do at least have some conversation about it and throw out some comps and this and that and the other. But with Nick, I wasn't asked and I didn't bring it up. And I actually it's the same book designer I've had. This is the fourth cover in a row he's done for me, and I've really loved his work. So I really trust him. But I think in back of my mind, I anticipated maybe like some type of black and white Paris scene or some type of, dusty war photo as a cover or something like that, some type of illustration. When they showed me this, it really grabbed me. And I was like, well, of course. I mean, if we're going to be bold with it, let's be bold with it. And the eyes in particular just knocked me out. I mean, they're clearly Nick's shell-shocked eyes, and the little strip of fire across the bottom too, I think really relates to the passage, that I just read. And there's a couple of other, allusions to fire in the novel. And yeah, I didn't debate it at all. I saw it and I loved it, and I thought, sure, why the hell not? Let's do it. And they loved it. You can always tell. I don't know how it is with Kaitlyn, but you can always tell that they really like the one they've sent you, and they don't want to send you anything else because they send you about 1,500 words as to why they love it so much. And so, fortunately, I was completely on board with it too, and I think it stands out nicely, and I think Kaitlyn's book cover is absolutely gorgeous. The profile in this is gorgeous there, right in the middle of all that tropical imagery. It's lovely.
Yeah, and we know we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, but when the cover is beautiful,
it doesn't hurt to have a good one.
Exactly, it definitely helps. I want to ask you, I'm going to start with Michael now, about your influences. So like, I know that your first novella, The Hands of Strangers, had echoes of Ernest Hemingway in it. Nick is obviously a prequel to The Great Gatsby. So, and you've already talked a little bit about how The Lost Generation was one of your influences in terms of your writer. I wonder, you're living in Oxford, Mississippi. Should we expect your next book to have some references to William Faulkner or similar?
I think I've dropped a couple little nice touches to Faulkner and some of the other ones. The Lost Generation, I came to writing later. I was like 29 or 30 years old before I ever sat down and tried to write a sentence. And fortunately, what preceded that was several years of just really falling in love with reading. And I think that's about as good a lesson as anybody can have when they're getting ready to write. I was living abroad, but when I came back to Mississippi, I realized I wanted to try it. And I'm like, okay, it's time to get baptized in the Mississippi and the Southern writers. I had already read Faulkner, and I don't know that I understood much of it, but I could tell that the language, there was something, I felt like I was holding something special when I read it. and then other writers that I discovered, more contemporary Southern writers were like William Gay, Larry Brown, Cormac McCarthy's been a big influence. But then just lapping back around, when you think about Mississippi, like the writers that I read and love, and it's just like looking over here at my bookshelf right now. I mean, there's Faulkner, there's Richard Wright, there's Eudora Welty. I mean, it's all kind of right here in my backyard, and so they've been very big influences to me. And I would say what I've always enjoyed doing too is reading author interviews and reading things about writer. I think reading author interviews is a great way to get behind the curtain. Similarly to like how Kaitlyn and I are talking now, and if anybody's thinking about writing, maybe they're grabbing something that we're saying to latch onto. But just the personal stories of like, you know, Richard Wright and Tennessee Williams and Larry Brown, and you know, you realize nobody, you know, wakes up a prodigy when it comes to writing literature and writing fiction. It's a lot of work and it's a lot of grind, and you kind of take everything that you've been molded into and bring it to the table and do the best you can. And those were the lessons I learned from, you know, all those writers, either Lost Generation or Mississippi or Southern or Midwestern or whoever. You know, I think we all kind of have that in common at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Kaitlyn, who have been your main influences when it comes to writing? Do you have any favorite authors?
Oh, you know, I think sort of like what Michael is alluding to is just reading really widely and reading really promiscuously and taking influences from sort of everywhere and anywhere, and being a reader as much as a writer in terms of, you know, who you're thinking about and who you're reading. When I was reading this book in particular, a really big challenge was knowing that it was going to be set and a character who is living in the 1860s and 1870s. So her speech patterns and diction is going to be really specific in a certain way, but I didn't want it to read sort of like stilted historical fiction type prose of like 19th century type prose. So it was trying to find language that felt slightly removed from our own time, but still sort of read really fresh. So I actually ended up reading a lot of poetry. I read Anne Carson's translation of Sappho's poems, because those are, you know, using really sort of archaic and old images, but it's Anne Carson. So the translations are really fresh and really accessible. And I also read similarly, just to get sort of different ideas of image and language. I read the Song of Solomon, in the biblical book Song of Solomon. I mean, Toni Morrison's great too, but I read Song of Psalms, and I was trying to sort of like figure out how to get sort of that poetic language around love and desire, because part of the book is about Libertie figuring out what she wants from romantic love and trying to figure out how to write about that in a way that felt true to the time period, but not cliche in any sort of way. So I tried to go towards sort of poetry and those older texts when I was crafting Libertie's voice.
Wow, amazing. So, I mean, you both have plenty of experience as writers. So I wonder, you know, after completing, you know, these recent publications that we are showcasing here, what have you learned about yourself as a writer that you didn't know before? Because I imagine that every time you write a book, you know, you make progress as a writer, you grow as a writer, right? So what have you discovered about yourselves that you didn't know before?
Well, I'll tell you a really interesting experience I had with Nick that answers this question is, just real briefly, I wrote Nick back in 2014, 2015 without telling anybody, because I knew it was a crazy idea and I didn't want to be told it was impossible. So I didn't tell agent, editor, anybody. My wife was the only person who knew that I was writing this book. So when I turned it in, I find out there's copyright issues, which I'm glad I didn't know, because I would have procrastinated. So I put it up on the shelf for 4 years and it sat there. Well, in the meantime, you know, and I wrote Nick after The Hands of Strangers and after Rivers too. So it wasn't the first, you know, me out of the gate or anything. But in the meantime, I wrote and published, Desperation Road and The Fighter in Blackwood. So that's 3 novels I put in between there. And so when 19 came around, it was time for me to sit down with my editor and revise Nick. When I went back and started reading it, I realized I was a better writer now than I was then, because it just in 4 years time of like really working and really being engaged in what I was doing. And that was a really interesting lesson to me, for me to look at the Nick that I was very proud of already. But then, just look at some of the sentences and like look at some of the dialogue and just going, who in the hell wrote this shit? Like I couldn't stand, things. And I was like, you can get better. Like it's clear, like no matter where you are in your writing life or artistic life or creative life or whatever, it is true. If you practice and you work, you are going to get better. And Nick is my experience with that novel is a fine example of that.
Fantastic. Kaitlyn, what about you? What have you discovered about yourself?
I think that writing this book has been sort of an exercise in sort of figuring out the time, I guess, that it takes to do a creative project. So I was writing this book as I was doing a lot of freelance work for nonfiction, and that work sort of goes on a different schedule than creating fiction does, because like you're on a deadline of a publication, and there's an immediate feedback around it. And what I really love about writing fiction is that it's outside of that sort of grind of time for the most part. You're creating on your own terms. Once you're working with a publisher, it changes a little bit differently, but for the most part, your sense of time and your sense of how you're going to interact with the project is really different than what comes when you're sort of writing something for a magazine or writing a review or writing something that to go up really, really quickly. And so it was really interesting and difficult at times to switch between those 2 time signatures. But I think I learned that I prefer the slower time of fiction.
That's really interesting. So what I'm hearing you both say is that definitely when you sit down to write, you have to be aware of the scope of the writing and the work that you're about to immerse yourself into. And there is value always in revising, drafting, re-editing, looking back at previous writing and making it better. So what other type of advice would you give to starting writers, specifically like creative writers? What would you tell them like that they should be aware of or do? What would you recommend?
I think it can be really easy to get caught up in wanting to write to what the larger culture tells you is important. And I think what's so wonderful about fiction is that everything is open to you to be interested in, to write about. And as long as you as the writer are sort of passionate about the story or the character that you're writing about, that's sort of all you really need to go with. I'm thinking about there's a lot of sort of back and forth about like, should you take writing classes or like go to an MFA, or like MFAs aren't helpful or whatever. But outside of that whole conversation is like, you need to be writing about the things that you personally actually care about. And oftentimes those will be things that the wider world is sort of like, why are you interested in that? And the more that you read widely and as a beginning writer and look at things, you realize that this is really sort of an idiosyncratic pursuit. And you really have to, one of the things about being a writer is learning to understand and trust and develop your own curiosity about the world, less than sort of figuring out, well, books about X seem to be selling at this moment, so let me try and write about this thing, or everybody seems to be really interested in this thing, so let me try and write about that. That's, to me, that sort of undercuts what the joy of fiction is, which is you get to follow sort of your own internal compass.
I would echo 1,000% what Kaitlyn's saying about, whenever I write a novel, I'm writing the novel that I want to read and nothing else. I'm my first audience and I'm my first critic, and really the most important. If you start writing a novel or a story or anything, and you're trying to think about who's on the other side of it or what they want to hear or what they want to feel, you're already putting yourself in an impossible position. Write for yourself. And then the other thing I would say is, she mentioned the word curiosity. You know, you hear the old adage, if you want to be a writer, you got to read a lot and write a lot. I would say the other thing you have to be is crazy curious about the world and about the craft itself. You know, I can remember sitting in audiences listening to writers, or sitting on the other side of workshop tables listening to writers. And if that person ever mentioned an essay to read on craft, or a novel that they read that impacted them, or a book on writing that you should read, I would write it down. And as soon as I was done, I was off to the library to go grab it and find it. And I would get it and I would read it. And I would sit in that room and I would look around, and I would be one of the only people, you know, writing it down. And now that I'm on the other side of that table or the other side of that podium, when I mention things like that, I look across and nobody's writing it down. And I used to berate people for that, but now I realize they're all my competition, so I don't even bother them with it anymore. I'm like, if you don't want to be curious and take advice and like go find and go look, then you're not going to be as good as you could be. I think you have to be crazy curious about the craft, about the art, and about the world around you, and go and find and do things without being told to go and find and do them necessarily.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Not being a creative writer myself, just teaching and studying them. But yeah, that's amazing. And obviously I have students who are doing their creative writing degree, and I will make sure to pass on all your advice to them and ask them to definitely watch the session. I want to thank you both so much for such a wonderful conversation. I have many more questions, but you know, I want to make sure that we let people get on with the rest of the sessions of the festival. But really, truly, thank you so much for such wonderful books, for such wonderful conversation, for your insights. And really, I cannot wait to read more of what you have to offer to us. Just keep coming, come with more. We need more of your stories for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for these wonderful questions.
Yeah, thank you both.